Well, hello everyone. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. My friends, the Davos 2022 meeting, which is essentially the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, which they had to cancel 2 times during the COVID years, has recently concluded. It lasted between May 22nd to May 26th, 2022, and it included a lot of big power players on the global economic and political stage, such as Klaus Schwab, the leader of Germany, Volodymyr Zelensky, John Kerry, and many other people representing think tanks, governments, various social causes, so on and so forth, meeting in the mountainous town of Davos to talk about how they are going to supposedly save the world. Klaus Schwab, who is the president of the World Economic Forum, a figure who has rightfully, in my opinion, drawn a lot of scorn from the right, opened the World Economic Forum at Davos with a set of principles that was going to be very integral and important to understanding what actually happened in that meeting. Because, my friends, there were over 450 sessions attended by 2,500 people, mostly people who were in the upper echelons of their respective industries and governments and institutions, but also people who were on the lower echelons as well. If you want to think in such a hierarchical way, it may not be beneficial for you, but if you want to. So it's going to be impossible for me to cover all the minutiae, but guess what? I don't have to cover all the minutiae of the agenda of the forum. Neither do you, because there are underlying principles that are rather simple, which will explain the folly in Schwab's project, and also explain the sinister nature of what's going on here at the WEF. But Schwab opened addressing several incidences, addressing COVID-19, the tumult rocking the global economy, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Climate change is a very big part of this meeting. In fact, John Kerry made headlines during this meeting for excoriating other human beings, in his words, for causing climate change and saying we have to take action, of course. And so Schwab provided the foundation for that by mentioning climate change in his initial speech. But what is more important here is that in his speech he outlined 3 core ways that the Davos 2022 World Economic Forum Convention can help ameliorate these issues. I will read those ways for you right now. He said the first way is by a public-private cooperation between the government and various institutions in society. And the idea is that the issues of the world cannot just be handled by governments, which I agree with, but Schwab takes it in an entirely different direction than I would. He says that they cannot be handled by governments, but they can be handled by governments, institutions, and experts coming together to essentially concoct plans to deal with these issues. We shall see the folly of this in a second. So he says, I don't want just private industry handling these issues. I don't want just government handling these issues. I want there to be a cooperation between governmental interest and private interest. And that's one of the ways we can affect change on a global scale, according to Klaus Schwab. Then he says he wants number 2, the second way, is by ensuring that we recognize systemic complexity. And I'll read a summary of his point there. He says, there is another reason for Davos 2022 fulfilling a special function. Challenges have political, economic, ecological, technological, and social dimensions and implications. Davos is the place to understand and to see the world in its systemic complexity. Therefore, the program is so rich with over 400 sessions. It is the place to gain new insights and to connect the dots, supporting more enlightened decision-making. This language is very important, collectively and individually. So this assumes a few things. Number 1, this assumes that the world is of a systemic fashion. And when you say systemic, it doesn't simply mean in terms of structures. He means in terms of artificial structures that are prominent in political dimensions, in the political dimension. So like nonprofits, institutions, organizations like his governments. And he is conflating that with the world as a whole. But we understand the world is not a world of systems. We are a world of interconnected processes and phenomena that go beyond mere system and therefore cannot easily be captured or controlled by the pen or the net of a central planner. Yet Schwab has outlined define this entire event as an attempt to see the world as a mechanism, like a system, that can be ordered and primed in certain directions. That is essentially the implication here, and that implication is affirmed by his emphasis on private interest marrying with governmental interest to enact his agenda, so on and so forth. And then the third way he believes that the world can be helped by the WEF is by, and I quote, ensuring stakeholder capitalism. Now, stakeholder capitalism, my friends, is essentially, it's a business model, or rather not a business model, it is an ideological poison which says that businesses should not care so much about profit. They should care about serving the community. They should care about serving people that are not just their shareholders. So essentially, this takes the obligation a business has to its core customer base and completely butchers that obligation and then reanimates that obligation in the form of this sort of mutated form of idea which says you now are obligated to everybody else that could potentially be impacted by your actions. That means your employees, that means the customers, that means local community groups, that means everybody. But the problem with this is if you're obligated to everybody, you're obligated to nobody. Obligation can only take place in a concrete fashion, or else it doesn't make much sense. If I'm obligated to give you something, it would not, that I could not execute that action functionally if that obligation was therefore made to the community, because the community is largely an abstraction. The world is built upon the interactions between various phenomena in their own individual capacities. We think of ecosystems, for example, not as simply large instances of animals doing something or plants doing something. We think of ecosystems as a sort of chain of various roles and opportunities taken about by different actors in those ecosystems to create the broader phenomenon. We don't think of rivers, for example, or we shouldn't think of rivers simply as a single stream going one way. No, rivers are many different things. Rivers are the, you can see the genesis of rivers in creeks, in rills, and you can see lakes leading to rivers as well. You can see estuaries, bogs, swamps that form from oxbow lakes that are formed when a river loses its energy. There are so many different ways to perceive a river. You can also perceive a river through the fish or the particular habitat of that river. A river is not merely a stream of water. It is so much more. A tree is not merely a husk of wood. It is so much more. It is the center of life in many different environments. But the problem is this sort of broad abstract idea of what people should do when we have, in terms of obligation, destroys the concrete relationship that individuals have with obligation. If there's no concrete relationship to obligation, it's not obligation. It cannot be executed beyond an abstract idea. Now, this is just Klaus Schwab speaking at the beginning of this event. As I mentioned, there's too much in the event to cover, but there were several other items released following from this meeting that are also equally concerning. We have, for example, the World Economic Forum at this event praising China's COVID response in the name of health equity. So essentially, the woman who did this is a lady who is very high up in the World Economic Forum, and this lady is called Sham Bishan, I hope I'm saying that correctly, head of shaping the future of health and healthcare at the World Economic Forum. And according to this article, they welcomed China's calling for the building of a community of common health for mankind. And then she, in addition to that, also praised China for contributing to the development of vaccines. Even though we know China skewed the data, we understand that China is now putting people in Shanghai in prisons in their own house, and in some cases, ripping them out of their own houses and shuffling them into camps where they're all being exposed for infection. We understand that China said in Shanghai, contain your soul's urge for freedom. We understand that China is operating on morally treacherous ground, and yet this lady who is high up in Schwab's little wet dream here is praising China despite the fact that these grievous actions undertaken in the name of public health are occurring. But because they're contributing to health equity, we can ignore those things. John Kerry was quoted as saying that he didn't really want to talk about the Uyghurs or any of the other people being abused in China. It's not his lane. This is the problem with people like this. We're going to get this in a moment. With the central planning mindset, it has a single-minded, narrow focus on the idea of the planner in the abstract, but it ignores everything that occurs on the ground. It is a sort of anti-reality mechanism, this central planning, and the thought processes that inform it are equally anti-reality because it does not adhere to any of the terms that we find in reality. One would say, if they're looking at this from a realistic and practical standpoint, a conceptual standpoint, that China is not furthering the health of anyone by undertaking brutal methods by which to administer their idea of health upon their citizens, including exposing their citizens to further infection, including lying about certain health data. Yet at the WEF, China has been praised. The metaverse. There was an entry from the WEF coming out of this meeting that basically said that the metaverse has so many opportunities to increase access and to help people who cannot travel physically in the world travel in the metaverse. But also, it could be exclusive to people who have more money to access the metaverse. So what do we have to do? We have to have governable processes. This is what their language. Governable processes in the metaverse to basically direct it towards the direction we want it to go to so that it doesn't go off to other directions. So essentially what they're saying is they want to control the metaverse and make it into a tool for their own agenda. Now, my friends, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the metaverse is merely this broader virtual reality that is being spearheaded by Zuckerberg and his compatriots that people can use to interact with virtual reality. The problem is virtual reality is not real reality. But we're seeing with the social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram being a part of that infrastructure of virtual reality, we're seeing an active attempt to force digitalization, force virtuality upon everyone, and then convert us, in a sense, into creatures of that kind of environment. This is the future, my friends. It's not all sinister, but a lot of it is concerning because it detaches man from the tangible world in which we get our moral understanding, in which we get our ability to think, in which we get our ability to act. This world that is not going to be able to be amendable, has never been amendable to one person's whim, is being rejected for a virtual reality that can be changed with a few codes and a few numbers here and there. And the WEF is saying, let's embrace this future and let's come ahead and go ahead and take control of it for our own gain. Do you guys see what is going on here? There's only a few more examples I need to make of this before I get to the broader point. Okay? I want you guys to get out of here so you can, I don't want to keep it forever. Jens Stoltenberg, the man who I believe is responsible for the turmoil in Europe right now, because he is the one, amongst many others, but he is the primary one who played around with Ukraine's membership in NATO in 2021 and told Vladimir Putin, don't worry if Ukraine joins NATO. It's a defensive alliance, and you should have it's none of your business because it's a defensive alliance. And of course, Putin was like, don't do that. And Stoltenberg just kept playing hot potato until Putin decided to fire the bullet. I'm not defending Putin, but I'm saying Stoltenberg is a part of this. He has culpability for what is going on right now in the war in Ukraine. But Stoltenberg said during a speech at the WEF at this meeting that freedom is more important than free trade, and that the protection of our values is more important than profit. Well, this is a false distinction. This is essentially equivocation. This is also a non sequitur. So first of all, freedom is not something that is gained through action, which is the implication of Stoltenberg's speech. And essentially what Stoltenberg was saying was that the economic turmoil that we're having right now is acceptable because we're trying to make sure that we have global freedom in the world or whatever. So freedom is not something that is gained. It is something that is retained and preserved. Stoltenberg's statement has a conceptual confusion because it views freedom as something gained. That's not the case. Free trade is merely an extension of using a mechanism to transfer one's skills between them and another party. So essentially, free trade is an extension of freedom. Yet Stoltenberg creates this false landscape in which freedom is not that, which basically misrepresents the meaning of freedom. So Stoltenberg is working from corrupt foundations. There's more. There's another session that said global parity, equality between the genders in pay will take 100 or plus years. And this should concern all of us. Why? Because it doesn't consider why there's a gender gap. It doesn't consider if that could be those different skills or different professions undertaken. It doesn't consider any of that. It simply treats it as bad. And anything proximal to that can fix it is good. Because in that same session, the people on the panel praised affirmative action, but said affirmative action just got us into the door. It didn't help us level up. Really? Is that so? Is that maybe because affirmative action is less about qualifications and more about the appearance of having someone on the basis of their identity into your institution, and qualifications being a spiritual value that are reinforced through your skill and your knowledge and the perpetuation of good activity might be more important than affirmative action? If these people had any ounce of introspection, they would realize the absurdity of their ideas. What's the point, Christian? What's the point? Because I gotta go, guys, because there's so many instances from these 450 plus sessions of this nonsense happening. The point is very simple, my friends. Central planning is a curse, and the WEF represents the most odious and egregious and flamboyant attempt currently in world politics to centrally plan this economy, to centrally plan this world. They speak in abstract terms, they speak in broad terms that reject the concrete relationships that society requires to exist, and then tries to cast the world in these abstract terms to make it more easily amendable. But guess what? Reality does not bend to your will. Reality is resolute, and it is and it is definite, and it does not change just because a few people with a bunch of money want it to change. Think of central planning like this. Think of it like attempting to control the flow of a river. So you have a dam, and dams, what they do is they can do a few things. They can control the flow of water and bring it down to a certain point to create electricity. They can direct the flow of water towards a different point to create a reservoir by which a community can fish, or they can get water from, or they can keep water back. But the problem is, while a dam has the ability to control the energy of the river for a little bit, if the river's energy is overpowering, the dam will break. Also, let's go even further with this. The waters, called a reservoir, like basically an artificial lake, created by dams, these waters are fundamentally different than natural lakes because these waters are essentially operating on the principle of control. The moment the controlling mechanism, which is the dam, breaks, these reservoirs typically flood everyone around them. These artificial man-made lakes are just like the artificial central planning tactics being used by the WEF. Because what happens when one natural occurrence like a flood and like rain or a flood happens to a dam, the dam breaks. What happens when a fault happens in the central planner's mechanism? The mechanism also breaks as well. There's many arguments against central planning, like Friedrich Hayek's idea that there's this knowledge problem, that there's this sort of spontaneous order to society, to reality that cannot be captured. But the bigger argument is this: central planning violates the principles of what it tries to control, and that is the activity of human beings. Human activity is dynamic, and it works best when it is left free of unnecessary inhibitions. Because just like a reservoir, just like an artificial lake, the moment you can try to contain human activity, there will be a point where things break, and when things break, some of the most odious things happen. Revolution is what I would use to describe the relationship between a dam and a reservoir and people and central planners. Because again, Machiavelli said in The Prince that if people remember the liberty, you cannot conquer them, you have to kill them. And that's why China told the people in Shanghai, contain your soul's urge for freedom, because just like a dam ready to burst, the people who are in this artificial environment, sustained by false laws, sustained by incorrect morals, sustained by the desire for authoritarian power and social planning in China, are ready to burst. So they have to say, no, don't burst, but it's inevitable. inevitable. It happens. The course of human events confirms this. And the WEF is setting themselves up for failure and setting us all up for failure and for a very dangerous situation. The more they attempt to control our actions and direct them into this very narrow inlet, like a dam, that will go into their reservoir. Human beings are not reservoirs to be maintained by ambitious dam makers. We are free-flowing, dynamic human beings. That is what America is built upon. And even though America is the only country in this world to really recognize that, every other human being abides by the same principles. The danger of the WEF, my friends, is not a danger of elites just having fun. I don't like when people call it elites. Forget that. That's a meaningless social distinction. The danger is what has been the danger all along of central planning. Misunderstanding the principles of human activity, then going ahead and butchering them for your own gain, and then not having the introspection to realize the wrong of what you're doing and the impending disaster of what you're doing. That's the danger of all of this. I don't want to live in a world where decisions are made or influenced by this close-knit group of people. I want to live in a world where I can make decisions for myself and where the course of events can happen naturally. But unfortunately, history is full of people who have no interest in making sure that can happen, have no interest in allowing the course of events to flow naturally throughout time, and who want to control them. But just like Stalin's collectivization of the kulaks during his reign, and just like any other attempt in Venezuela to nationalize economies, what happens is impending disaster, not just because their actions were done the wrong way, but because in principle, things function according to a certain standard. And when you try to amend that certain standard for your own goals and desires, things collapse and disaster ensues. Central planning is immoral. It is a rejection of the principles of humanity which allow life to function. It's immoral when Stalin did it. It's immoral when Chavez did it. It's immoral when Barack Obama tried to do it with healthcare. It's immoral with the NHS in England. And guess what? It's immoral when Klaus Schwab and his people try to get together and do it in the mountainous region of Davos. That's why we should reject the WEF and what they're trying to do. Allow things to happen naturally, not through a forced hand, perpetuated supposedly by these benevolent people, because they're anything but. Think on it. My friends, love you guys so much. That was a rant, my God. If you love me, please be sure to support me on Patreon, patreon.com/PhilCWatson, or PayPal official@cwatson@gmail.com. I'll be sure to like this video, to subscribe to this channel, to share this video, to join my Discord. This message is dynamite, my friends. I love you guys so much. Please stay pensive. Bye, guys.